Hello and welcome to another Toll Tickets presentation. Today I wanted to take a more detailed look at the subject of city tolling. This is something I receive quite a lot of questions about from people working within the broader mobility services ecosystem. And within these questions and discussions that come up, I hear a lot of different perceptions and a lot of different understandings of what city tolling actually means, what it stands for, and where it is currently being used and where it is likely to be introduced. Now, I call this series Tolling in Europe. However, to shed some more light on what city tolling actually is, and where it's likely to be deployed in future, I'm going to take a slightly more global view in this presentation and use some examples from North and South America and Asia, as well as Europe, to paint a fuller picture. Because the subject matter is a little bit broader than usual, I am going to split this video into two. In this part one, I'm going to discuss some definitions and existing deployments of what can come under the umbrella term city tolling. And then in part two, I'm going to look at some of the proposed and currently under discussion future deployments, and also consider what the differences are in some of these different schemes that come under the banner of city tolling, and the implications and impacts that they can have. So before we start, as always, I would just like to point out that you can access all previous videos, previous presentations via the YouTube channel. This is now the 10th video in the series, so if you'd like to hear more of my ramblings on other subjects, or if you just need a more effective way of putting your children to sleep at night, you'll find several hours worth of content on YouTube that will serve absolutely that purpose. Just serve toll tickets. Just search toll tickets tolling on YouTube. So, as I mentioned, today I'm going to start with some definitions. I've titled this presentation City Tolling, but in reality, city tolling does not really exist in the way it suggests. City tolling is used, as I mentioned, as a bit of a catch-all term to describe a variety of different schemes that are either planned or already in place. So I guess I just want to unpack that a little bit. And to start with, what do we actually mean by tolling? Typically, tolling relates to a charge that is collected on each trip along a specific bridge, tunnel, turnpike, road, or road network. Tolls are generally applied at all times, and the funds that are collected from the tolls are generally used for the repayment of debts incurred in building the road or maintenance or operation of that stretch of asphalt. San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge has a toll, for example. The North Connects Tunnel in New South Wales has a toll. The A6 in between Paris and Dijon has a toll. These are all examples of tolling. For a bridge or a tunnel, the amount is generally fixed, but of course on longer stretches of road like that A6 in France that I just mentioned, the amount is typically calculated according to the number of individual sections along that road, and it is fair to say, of course, that the longer the road, the higher the cost, and each of those sections is generally charged in a way that is roughly equivalent to their distance. After tolling, we have road pricing, which again is one of these terms that can mean a variety of different things. In this context, in this sort of urban city context, the most obvious example is in Singapore, where they have a what is known as ERP, electronic road pricing scheme. It's been in operation for many years. Here, the technology used is actually the same as tolling. It is a DSRC, dedicated short-range communications technology using free flow or open road barriers. Like tolling, the charge is levied across a specific network. It is generally applied at all times to all vehicles. Um, Sometimes they do temporarily remove some of these tolls, but generally speaking, they apply at all times for all vehicles. Maybe a difference to tolling is that in this case, in Singapore's case, the funds generated by this road pricing are not necessarily assigned to that specific road for maintenance or operation. They're in fact put within the general budget of the collecting authority, and therefore not necessarily allocated in the same way as funds that are generated for tolling. So next we have urban access schemes. These are enforcement only schemes, which is a key differentiator. Um, Urban access schemes are quite a common sight in many cities around the world, but particularly in Italy is particularly well known for urban access schemes where most cities have one. Um, as I said, these are enforcement only schemes that are designed to restrict traffic entering a particular area in general. They do not distinguish between particular types of vehicles. Um, they're there just to stop vehicles entering usually what is a city centre location, with the exception of maybe residents or delivery vehicles or city-owned vehicles, of course. Again, any funds that are generated will come mostly in the form of fines rather than charges. And again, they're not specifically assigned to any road maintenance or building scheme. They would just go into the general budget of the charging authority. Then we have congestion charging. So congestion charging was probably made famous by London when it was launched in 2003. It is a single time-based fee that is charged on a daily basis upon entry into a designated area. So London has a cordon-based scheme around the centre of the city. Once you enter there, on any given day, you have a daily fee, regardless of how many times you enter, how many times you leave, how much driving you do within that zone. You pay a single fee for that day. There's no distance-based component at all, and unlike tolling, again, this is a scheme not just in London, in other cities like Stockholm and Gothenburg. Congestion charges are generally applied during peak hours only. Also, some congestion charges do exempt electric or hybrid or low emission vehicles from the scheme. That is the case in London, for example, today. If you drive a Tesla, for example, you're not paying the congestion charge. Again, different to a toll, which is generally levied on all vehicles. Then we have low emission zones. These are a much newer innovation, whatever you want to call them. They sit somewhere in between urban access schemes and congestion charges. Again, they are technically enforcement only schemes. However, unlike urban access schemes, they don't block certain vehicles from entering the zone. Rather, they charge them if they do. They're mostly applied at all times, here with the aim, as an environmental aim, to reduce overall emissions, not necessarily tackle congestion or generate funds for roads. The aim and the ambition here is to reduce emissions, particulates, this kind of thing. So today, if you were to drive a, say, 10-year-old Volkswagen Golf into central London, as an example, which has both a congestion and a low emissions scheme, you would pay both of those. You would pay a congestion charge and a low emissions fee. If you were to drive a Tesla, you would pay neither. Again, like congestion charges and urban access schemes, any funds generated again flow into the charging authority's general budget, and will be spent how they see fit. And finally, we have odd-even access schemes. I doubt many people would refer to these as city tolling. However, they are a bit of a forerunner to the more technically sophisticated schemes like congestion charging or low emission zones. And they're often put in place to try and achieve the same goals or tackle the same problems. They are as simple as they sound, which is the banning of all vehicles with a license plate beginning with either an odd or an even number on particular days. A lot of these schemes are still applied today throughout the world, but they're generally applied on an irregular basis, and again, not with the intention to generate funds of any kind. And any monies that are collected, again, would just be in the form of fines, and would just go into the overall budget of the collecting authority. So before we look at where these different schemes under the banner of city tolling are in operation today, I wanted just to give a comparison with what we might term as more traditional tolling installations, as I defined earlier. As we can see, many countries in the world, I have detailed this in previous presentations, have some form of tolling in place. In most cases, these are inner city or highway tolls, but there are a large number of bridges, tunnels, and turnpikes that are close to urban locations as well. I mentioned a couple of examples earlier, Golden Gate Bridge, cases in Australia, elsewhere. But these tend to be access routes in and out of cities, and very rarely within cities. If we then compare these, though, to where we see these truly city-based or urban schemes that I've just mentioned, congestion charging, low emission zones, etc., there are far fewer of these in place. And I do want to stress that this graphic is not exhaustive, particularly when it comes to odd even access schemes. These have been applied on again, an irregular basis in many parts of the world. They're also quite hard to measure because they sort of pop up and they're not necessarily a permanent feature. They can just be applied as and when without any kind of technical apparatus in place. They've even been used in cities like Paris, as I've highlighted here. Up until a few years ago, Paris was using odd even schemes on, as I say, on an irregular basis on some days. Today, they're still used in cities like Bogota, Delhi in India, Jakarta in Indonesia, but not necessarily every day or on a permanent basis. If we look at things like urban access schemes, as I mentioned, they do exist in many cities around the world, sometimes in very specific, quite small areas. If we look at things like congestion charging, as I mentioned, most people would point to the examples in London, Gothenburg, and Stockholm in Sweden as forms of what we understand to be congestion charging. And then when we look at low emission zones, these are quite a European-centric feature at the moment. In the next presentation, we will look at other areas where these are being discussed, but at the moment, in terms of where they are deployed, very European-centric. A lot of cities in the UK are starting to deploy them. Countries like Germany have what you might describe as a low emissions zone, although these are more emissions stickers that must go on vehicles. Not quite the same thing, really. Again, more of a sort of forerunner to what we would currently understand a low emission zone to be. And then finally, road pricing, as I mentioned, is really restricted to Singapore at the moment. But this is changing fast. In the next presentation, we will look at how and where this is changing and maybe what some of the implications of those are as well. So thank you for listening. Part 2 of this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel at the same time. There's also a link I will put in this video at the bottom of the screen there. And as always, if you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to get in touch.